Okay. Thank you, David, for that introduction. So we have, I believe, approximately an hour in your calendars for this. We're probably going to be finished though within 45 minutes. We ran one last week, and yeah, we got through the content in about that time. As David said, just to restate, if you do have any questions, please use the chat box. You've all, I think, found it because you've been communicating with us already. So thank you, and keep the questions coming. As David said, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions at all, please do just ask away. If there are any questions we can't answer for whatever reason, we'll endeavour to get back to you quickly after the session is complete, and we will make this recording available to others who are unable to attend today. So we are going to cover over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. So I'm just there we go. Hopefully, can everybody can I just check everyone can see the slides? We've checked on the audio. Okay, good. So slides are working. There tends to be a very short lag, so I'll make sure that I wait a couple of seconds before moving on from slide to slide. What we'll cover today is the business case for a strengths-based approach to selection. We'll pose and then answer the question, are strengths and competencies different? There's an additional piece in here which is about strengths-based job analysis. Very quick but an important addition to the agenda you can see here. Want to talk to you about the OPAL approach, which is the Strengths Partnership developed approach to interviewing, and give you a kind of overview of that. And then move into talking briefly about broader strengths-based assessment, so not just interviewing, but how you would integrate the strengths approach into a broader strengths assessment process, assessment centres, but also the whole kind of nose-to-tail recruitment process. And then finally, how to access the approach if you're interested in taking it further. So hopefully everyone's on the right webinar. First question is, and I don't know what's going on in this photograph, has this guy been fired? Has the lady been fired and she just needs time alone? I don't know, but there it is. So the question to pose to yourselves is how to calculate the cost of a poor hiring decision. And there are a fair few researchers who've attempted to answer this question. Fairly conservatively, I think, is the general view. Gallup, for example, estimate the annual cost in lost productivity due to disengagement at work in the US alone is 450 to 550 billion. Another researcher has talked about the average cost of a poor hire is estimated at 30% of the individual's first year salary, but it can be much higher than that, partly because of the hidden costs, which are much more difficult to measure accurately. So lowered productivity, the morale of the broader team being lowered, time spent managing the poor performer, potentially time lost in onboarding, upskilling if rehiring is needed, the time spent searching for a replacement. Generally the knock-on effects for the team more broadly of a poor hire are really quite significant and can have a medium to long-term effect, much more broadly than just the individual's own cost and the rehiring cost. So there are many hidden costs as well, which is why it's worth considering alternatives to the traditional approach to hiring. Which moves us on to the strengths-based approach to selection. So what we found through experience over a number of years is that if you introduce the strengths component into your hiring approach, an existing hiring approach, it will help you to get to the real person, their passions, their energy, what it is that really drives them, what it is that really matters to them. And it separates out increasingly what we're finding to be the good competency interviewee. And what I mean by that, and many of you who are working in this space will already know, now many people will prep themselves incredibly well for a standard traditional competency-based interview. They'll arrive at interview with an armful of excellent examples of where they've demonstrated each of the target competencies for the role. And because they know that this is going to be positive or likely to be positively scored, so almost the more examples and the more varied examples people bring, the better. And that means that you can get a very high score, almost an inflated score, using that as an approach. Now, time will come, no doubt, when there will be similar tutoring and preparation given on strengths-based interviewing, but we're not there yet. And arguably, even when we do get there, we're still really only going to be looking for who the real person is, who the authentic candidate is in that interview. So it's much less easy to prepare for a great score. It's much more of a two-way process, if you like, with both parties making decisions as to whether the fit is right. And partly because of that, there's an improved candidate experience that's been reported widely now, improvements in employer brand perceptions as well because of that. And finally here, the strengths-based approach will help assess motivational fit, team fit, and cultural fit. So there's a whole bunch of other components here, but where we certainly found unsuccessful candidates more accepting of rejection because they're receiving positive feedback on their strengths and where they may be a better fit. So again, leading to an improved candidate experience. Reduced hire costs due to reduction in attrition. So first 6 months, first 12 months, the fit is better, so people are less likely to leave. They'll feel less likely to have been missold to with the role because it's a much more open conversation. Reduced training and onboarding costs because new hires are motivated very early on to stretch their strength areas. The hiring manager will understand the strengths, which actually leads us to an important additional point around the integration of selection and assessment with induction to get the most value from the approach. More engaged employees, therefore an improvement in satisfaction, in loyalty, even in profits. And teams and managers don't suffer morale dips because they're carrying new hires who don't fit in the organization, and then all of the negative consequences of having to exit somebody during or following on shortly after their probation. So new hires end up being high performing, more confident, less stressed, higher energy levels, more resilient, and more likely to develop and to want to develop. Important point, this competency versus strength, and this is a question that is often asked when an organization is considering whether to upgrade or amend their existing assessment approach. And there are differences. Our view, by the way, is that you need both, and you'll see why we advocate that in a little while. But in essence, the difference is, as we see it, and as we define strengths, that the competency is job specific to the role, whereas a strength is more individual driven, it's more person driven, and can cross role boundaries and even organizational departmental boundaries. The competency approach, as it's been introduced over the past 20, 30 years, is more normative. The aim is to develop rounded performance, to bring people up to a minimum standard and a minimum level, whereas the strength approach is more of a spike style, which recognizes that everybody is unique, the individual in the process. Who is this person going to be in the role? How are they going to perform, and how are they going to perform differently from others? And finally, the competency approach tends to describe current performance, whereas the strength approach describes more future potential for learning, which is why having both we found is extremely helpful, because you do need both. Indeed, for us, it's when there's a coming together of these three components that you can see in the diagram here, your strengths, the skills, the tasks that you're delivering, your skills, your competencies, and also the organization's goals and the organization's values as well. So in the coming together of those three components, you can witness individuals, candidates, and then employees who are able to attain peak performance levels because they have the skills and the competencies needed, because they love what they do, so they have the strengths for the role, and they're aligning those competencies and those strengths with the organization's goals and the organization's values. We have a video clip that we use on this. I'm not going to try and show that to you now because of the difficulties of showing video on this platform, so we'll send you the link. It's Steve Jobs talking about passions and how important those are to achieve sustainable peak performance. So we'll send that to you with the pack we send out afterwards. Growing evidence then with the strengths-based approach. There's some quotes here from a variety of different organizations, seeing some real shifts, some genuine movement in their metrics, reducing hire cost, reducing staff turnover, increasing in sales, and comments here as well about the strengths-based approach. Do feel free to ask questions as we go, by the way, and as we perhaps go into the next section, there'll be some more things to ask about. And so really in terms of this set of evidence, and there is a lot more and it is growing, this is just a summary slide, of course. If you're considering introducing this into your own organization or your clients' organizations, one of the things we would encourage is for you to think very carefully about what will speak to that organization. What is the proof of concept they're likely to need to see before they move ahead with the strengths approach? How would it be piloted? With what group? Where is going to be the best fit? How are you going to gather evidence that it's working and that the change is actually worthwhile, even if it's a tweak to the existing process, because it's going to cost. It's going to cost in terms of training people. It's going to cost in terms of design of new materials, and so forth. So it's not a negligible cost. And for most organizations, they'll want to see some proof of it working. Okay, there is a question that you can all see, I think, which is, can you use Strengthscope to create an ideal profile against which to assess potential candidates? What are the downsides of this too? Great question. For those of you that don't know, because there may be some who aren't familiar with Strengthscope who are on the webinar, I'm not sure. Strengthscope is a strengths-based assessment tool that we've developed over the past 10 years to help identify what it is that energizes people in the workplace. It is a psychometric tool, so it's robust, it's reliable, it's valid, and it's numbers-based, which means that very much you can use Strengthscope to help, first of all, build a strengths-based role profile, and then to potentially assess people against that. But we wouldn't advocate using it in isolation. So it's a timely question, partly because the next slide talks about building a strengths role profile. And one of the things that you can do in order to build that strengths role profile, and again, as with any role profiling process, any job analysis process, be it traditional or new and different, you want to gather data from a variety of different angles. And we would suggest that a Strengthscope profiling process will help add to that list of evidence that you're building up about the particular role. So one option that we've used successfully is to Strengthscope profile the high performers in an existent role and the lower performers in that role, and look for patterns, look for differences in the strengths profiles of each of those. So what I'm talking about here is developing a group profile for your high performers, a group profile for poor performers, and then using that as a means really for interviewing and discussing with both role holders but also with line managers and other key stakeholders what those differences might actually mean. How do we make sense of them? There's a note here around ethical considerations. Now, if you're doing that kind of research within a client organization, you need to be careful about how that's being messaged and communicated as a piece of research. It's just a sensitivity around it, because you do need, ideally, poor performers and good performers, and to know from some method of measurement who are good performers and who are not. Probably the best way to communicate that will be that there is some research being undertaken currently by the organisation to improve the selection process within the organisation, and therefore there's some strengths role profiling going on, which doesn't necessarily tell them whether they're in a high-performing or a low-performing group, but that in itself is a challenge. In addition to that, we would advocate other methods as well. So interviewing stakeholders as you would with a standard job analysis. So job holders as well as line managers. What makes a good role holder? What makes a good employee in this particular part of the organisation? And also developing job outcome statements. And I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But job outcome rather than input statements relating to job descriptions, specifically focusing on what the organisation wants the outcomes to be from the role. What are the key measures of success? Apologies for any laughter you can hear in the background. There's just some funny rain-related humour going on, I think. It's raining here, for those of you who aren't currently in the southeast of the UK. And apparently that's funny to the team. So there are a range of different approaches here that and we haven't got time to go into detail with these. But to go back to the question that we were asked, some 5 minutes ago, can you use Strengthscope to create an ideal profile against which to assess potential candidates? The answer is yes, but we do not advocate necessarily saying, okay, if you have your Strengthscope ideal profile, and then you have your Strengthscope profile for each candidate. If you look at the mapping and the matching of those two, that's sufficient information to make a decision. We don't believe that to be the case. We believe that if there is a good match, you need to look for evidence of how that apparent match on paper actually presents itself in reality. And that can be done through interview. It can also be done through broader assessment centre exercises and activities. In addition, almost irrespective of the strengths that an individual has for a role, they have certain strengths. They have who they are and who it is that they're going to bring to that role, what their top 3 strengths are and how they have used those in previous roles and would intend to use those in this role, is a really important part of the OPAL interviewing process, which we'll talk about next. So we advocate a combination approach. It's not just saying, you have to have those particular Strengthscope strengths to be effective in the role. We're also saying we want to understand what your strengths are, what you know of them, how you've learned how to use them most effectively. Can you dial them up? Can you dial them down? What have you learned when it's gone wrong and hasn't worked out for you in a certain situation? We really want to hear about their self-knowledge around their strength areas, as well as their skill and experience areas as well. So hopefully that answers that earlier question. Moving on then to the OPAL interviewing technique. OPAL because, 2 reasons actually. It's an acronym for outcomes, productive use of strengths, agility and learning. And also because in nature, OPALs can actually diffract light and appear differently coloured in different conditions. And we feel that captures the whole strengths-based approach to interviewing, because this is about helping interviewers discover the real candidate and their unique strengths, rather than proposing a kind of standard competency-based one-size-fits-all approach. So for us, this kind of notion of the refracting of light and being able to capture all colours of the rainbow is a really fundamental part of the OPAL interviewing process and the whole strengths assessment process more broadly. It welcomes and encourages diversity in the assessment approach because it is encouraging an exploration of the individual strengths, skills, experience. So, as mentioned, OPAL covers these 4 important areas, and together these areas are assessing the effectiveness that an individual is likely to display in the role. So you start with outcomes. You've developed those in the strengths role profiling, the strengths-based job analysis that we were just talking about. You're then interested in understanding the productive strengths that will help deliver those outcomes. So where those strengths that the individual have delivered outcomes in the past and where they're likely to in this role. Also, the extent to which the individual is able to dial up, dial down the strengths, use them in an agile way across different situations, and where this hasn't worked out, to learn from those mistakes as well as successes in order to drive that consistent performance level. So, as I mentioned, those 4 components to OPAL map onto the first of these 3 aspects of our recommended approach to strengths-based interviewing and strengths-based assessment more broadly. So effectiveness is the first of those, which includes the skill, the experience, and the productive use of strengths in delivering effective job outcomes, and also that flexibility of skills and strengths in an application of learning from successes and mistakes. The second element is around energy, and this is where the strengths aspect really comes in. So this is the match between Strengthscope strengths identified for the outcome and the candidate strengths, as well as the likely energy and natural fit for each role outcome. Just had a question, which I'm delighted to say we will shortly provide an answer for, because I'm going to go through a worked example, a real example in a second. The final component for us that's important is the assessment of fit. I mean, we find this in many organizations with many assessment processes. This notion of fit is being increasingly introduced. But it's often a bit of a kind of add-on to the end of a process. There's maybe a question about cultural fit, but it hasn't necessarily been thought through as much as the competency-based aspects of the process. So for us, this is an important aspect, and we define it as the extent to which the candidate is likely to find the team and or the organisation draining or energising to work for, based on an alignment, a fit with the culture, with the values, etc. And there's a variety of questions you can ask around this, depending on the client, depending on the role. But questions like, describe what things need to be in place at work for you to perform at your best. And of course, you're assessing that against what's the reality of the role and the organisation. Describe the type of team where you're most likely to thrive. What are your top 2 or 3 values? How do these play out at work? How have they guided your career decisions to date? Those kinds of questions. As I mentioned, I wanted to just give you a real world example of how this looks and how these questions are formulated in practice. So we have an example here from a role of business development manager. Could be any, but it's just one that we've developed. The job outcome, which you'd normally read to the candidate, and actually this would probably be part of the role profile they've already seen. So it could be described as a key measure of success, or role outcome, key role outcome, or whatever. For this one, it's developing relationships with new clients, working closely with the consulting team, in this case, to generate interest, stimulate momentum, and ultimately close sales in product, consultancy, and training solutions. Key strength could be strengths. In this case, we've tried to boil it down to its absolute essentials. For this one, it's relationship building. You probably wouldn't tell the candidate that. You would just have that as part of your strengths-based role profiling process. There could be other strengths though that are important in that particular context that you've identified through this strengths-based role profiling job analysis. Question 1 is outcome related. Tell me about when you've won a major new account with a client. Question 2 focuses then on the productive strengths, the P of OPAL. What strengths, what skills, what knowledge did you draw on to drive that outcome? So you notice there we've included strengths, we've also included skills, we've also included background knowledge and experience. Follow-up question, what did you find most energizing about the situation? What did you find least energizing about the situation? There we're moving more into energy. And then finally, combining agility and learning, the A and the L of OPAL. Tell me about a similar situation that's gone less well for you. What did you learn about yourself in this situation? And how have you applied that learning in other situations? How would you apply the learning in this role? You end up with a scoring framework, which I'll move on to talk about. Hopefully that was helpful just as an example of the kinds of questions. And they're not by any means, definitive. You would vary those questions depending on the role, perhaps the role level, the sector, etc. But those are the kinds of questions that we formulate around the OPAL framework in order to get that kind of broader assessment of the individual. Okay, so moving on. Scoring the interview, devil, as always, is in the detail with assessment. So the way that we assess those 3 components, the E, the E and the F, effectiveness, energy and fit. For effectiveness, it's that a relevant outcome has been described, so they give you a good example of a good outcome with strong evidence of the personal impact of their strengths rather than the we thing. We did this and it was us that, and the team went and da-da-da. But the personal impact of their own strengths, their own skills, their own knowledge. They also need to demonstrate flexibility and application of learning in future situations to score well in that area. Energy, so they're highly energized by the strength or strengths that you've identified for that role outcome for that role. They are able to describe how they enjoy using the strength, and they're engaged and in flow when using it. And that information is going to come partly from the content of what they say, in fact largely from the content of what they say. There's an overlay as well of how they're describing it, how demonstrative they're getting and using perhaps body language and etc. But we're always cautious about overdoing that, because people are different, and some people can be very contained and very controlled in an interview. Other people are very expressive. So we recognise that that's a component to be aware of. And when we go on to talk about wider assessment methods, and in particular video interviewing, that's another area where you're likely to see a bit more of that expression, a bit more of the body language coming through. But look at it with caution. It needs to be objectively assessed, and everyone has their own calibration, their own benchmark. The final point is fit, and the likely fit of the individual with the organisation. To what extent are they likely to find the organisation and the team highly energising to work for? I've given you some examples of the kinds of questions we would use to identify that, establish that. So beyond interviewing, and we've talked primarily about the interview approach in quite a lot of depth today, but of course it's not good practice to only use an interview. There are a whole raft of alternative assessment techniques, and we've used all of them. And we would strongly advocate, the objectification of the entire nose-to-tail assessment process. As far as possible, actually, if you're introducing strengths into the later stages, for example, with interviews, perhaps bring strengths in earlier as well where you can, so that the candidate has that kind of joined up experience right the way through, and they can see that this is a different type of approach that's being taken at all stages. Now, we don't have time to go into this in too much detail today, But there are some examples here that we can share with you. So screening interviews, of course, would be one alternative to screen in and out candidates without the base level of skill or experience or qualification. Video interviewing, you may have come across, it's being used increasingly widely now. We've used it too. There are providers out there who specialize in providing the platforms around video interviewing. It's a very kind of specialist form of software. It needs to be really robust in order to be effective. And it can provide a whole bunch of benefits, actually. So, for example, having it asynchronous, essentially the individual will come to the video interview. There'll be maybe 4, 5, 6 questions that they're asked to respond to. And those questions will be pre-prepared, they'll be standardized, and they'll be live in the way that they're answering them live, but there's no interviewer asking the questions. So they'll pop up on the screen, or they'll be voiced over on the screen, and the candidate will respond to them in the moment. They'll have a limited time to respond. The responses are then captured in the database, and of course one of the big benefits of that is for the recruitment interviewer, that they can stack up a whole series of interviews and score them all in one go. So, really helpful in terms of reliability, helpful in terms of time scheduling, avoiding kind of issues of dropouts, etc. And you get to see some additional information than you would if it was just simply a telephone interview too, because you've got the person themselves, recording themselves from typically from home. Most people will do it that way. Certainly for Generation Y, millennials, they have no issue with this, and most people now are kind of familiar enough with Skype and with other forms of video platform that they're comfortable to be filmed. So yeah, we're seeing this used more and more now. Actually, if anyone's interested to hear in more detail about video interviewing, we are planning to run a webinar specifically on that topic, probably before Christmas. It's going to be in the next couple of months, possibly very early next year. Psychometric information we would also advocate the use of. Could be ability tests, personality tests, whatever it is that's going to be related to the role. And assessment center exercises too. So they could be role plays, they could be group exercises, career presentations, case studies, in addition to a strengths-based interview during the assessment center itself. And these can be an excellent way, in fact, a crucial way at the later stages of assessment to observe strengths in action and strengths in overdrive, so where strengths are going too far, and also to assess the individual's level of awareness of strengths being used productively, strengths perhaps being underused, strengths going into overdrive. And the way that you can capture that, as well as an interview, is through the use of post-exercise reflection sheets, where people are asked a series of questions around what could have gone better, what went really well, where were they most energized, where were they least energized, all that good stuff. And those can be objectively scored. They can certainly be fed into an integration process at the end, so you can get a really good read on the level of awareness of and utilization of strengths as well. So the summary from this is strengths interviewing is almost certainly not enough. It helps, and it's definitely, in our experience, more effective than competency-based interviews alone, but we would strongly recommend that any organization introducing strengths into their process considers doing more than just strengths interviewing, and the more you can do it, the better, at more stages of the recruitment process. I think that brings us pretty much to a conclusion, unless anyone has any questions. We have here on this final slide just an illustration of the various different approaches that we take and we advocate at different time stages of the employee life cycle, from recruitment through leadership development, team development, and OD and engagement. We've just been talking about that first column, energized talent, today, but we've developed a whole set of solutions around these other important areas of organizational life as well. So does anyone have any questions from today's presentation? Anything about the OPAL interview? Anything about anything we've talked about, really? Okay, that looks like a no. So thank you very much for taking the time. We've actually finished a little earlier than planned, probably about 5 minutes earlier. Really appreciate you taking the time today out of your busy calendars. And just to finish off, I'd like to pass back over to, here's a question. Okay, so the question that we have is, I think people are starting to leave, but there is a question, and it is, how is the outcome of relationship building that we mentioned different to a competency? So just turning back to where we were talking about that. So we're talking here about the job outcomes. So developing relationships with new clients, working closely with the consulting team to generate interest, stimulate momentum, and ultimately close sales in product consultancy and training solutions. I think that was the one that's being talked about. So that was the job outcome that was described. The key strength that we'd identified for that particular role as an individual strength is taking steps to build networks of contacts and act as a hub between people you know. That is the Strengthscope definition of relationship building. The really important difference of that as a key strength is that it's about what energizes and motivates the individual. So it's actually the language used there sounds quite competency-y, but when you get into discussion with people about their likelihood of relationship building and to what extent they're engaged with that and they enjoy it, then the conversation shifts significantly. So someone who reports that as a Strengthscope strength is likely to spend a lot of time networking, a lot of time building connections between people that they know, and they'll get a huge amount of enjoyment and engagement from that process. So the OPAL interviewing process is designed to dig into that and to find out to what extent, not just whether they have the skill for doing that, but whether they have the energy and the enthusiasm for doing that as well day to day. Is it something that they're just naturally driven by? And what skills, what experience have they developed and gained in order to utilize that natural drive and strength? That's the difference. It's kind of, because our experiences on paper, you could look like a perfect fit from a competency point of view. So yeah, I do a lot of networking. It's something I'm very skilled at. Sure, but is it something you enjoy doing? Because if it's not something you enjoy doing, then it's a, yes, I can do that. I know I should do that, but do I want to do that? And so people can turn up at work every day feeling a little bit deflated and demotivated pretty quickly. So hopefully that explains a little bit. We do have a workshop around how to develop a strengths-based interview, and we go into the difference between strengths and competencies there in more detail. We have another question, which is, do you provide a visual match of role profile against individual ones, or is it up to the interviewer to review both profiles? Oh, you can do either, actually. So the example I was reading from, actually, there's a space in the interview script to capture the top 7 strengths in Strengthscope, and then to assess against that kind of on paper. But really the focus of the interview is to explore in a more conversational way, in a more kind of, discursive way, I guess. How does that play out in a practical sense in the current role or in past roles? Yes, you can provide that visual matching, and in fact, in some scripts that we've developed, some approaches we've developed for clients, we've got space for that, so they can see the kind of match. But the challenge with that is that there may be too much emphasis placed on the match or mismatch of strengths for some hiring managers, and actually it may be better to just give a kind of overall indication of likely fit, but really you want to move it into that conversation, those interview questions to get a better read on level of energy and level of effectiveness for that person. Is the technology there to overlay the two profiles? Wouldn't that be nice? No. Is the short answer to that question. It wouldn't be beyond applicable, but although apps don't cost much to people to buy, they cost quite a lot, I think, to develop, and we haven't gone that far yet. But it's a good idea. Okay, as I say, I'm going to pass back over to David now, just to finish off. But keep the questions coming. If we can't answer any right now in the time we've got, we'll respond afterwards by email.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Paul. We hope everyone found that session to be insightful and a good introduction to the strengths-based approach to selection as well. Just while we're on this slide, and a little bit of self-promotion on our part, we do have a couple of future webinars in the offering. So you see there around inspirational leadership and peak performing teams. So we've actually got a webinar on the 27th of October looking at strengths-based leadership, and also on the 11th of November for performance management. So please feel free to join us for those sessions as well. And just for follow-up as well, so Paul mentioned about the Steve Jobs link. It's a really interesting YouTube video on that, which basically has Steve Jobs just advocating hiring passionate individuals who are willing to play to their strengths, and that really kind of encapsulates a lot of what Paul mentioned in that video as well. So that's definitely worth a watch. We'll also send over slides and a recording of today's session, and if you can also just leave a little bit of evaluation for us on the back of this session, we'd really appreciate that for future sessions as well, a few takeaways for us on that side of things. So a member of the team will be in touch on the back of that. If you've got any further questions, we're happy to take those away offline as well to discuss that a little bit further. Thank you very much for your time today, and we've really enjoyed it. Hopefully you have too, and enjoy the rest of your day. Many thanks.
Thanks everybody, and bye.